Okay, we're good.
Okay,
I'm clicking go live.
we're live.
We are live.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Socialist Action webcasts. My name is Elizabeth Weiss, and I'm the Federal Treasurer of Socialist Action and a member of the NDP Socialist Caucus Steering Committee, and your host for this webcast, along with our technical producer, Daniel Charade, and of course, behind the scenes, our political producer, Barry Weisletter. We acknowledge that this event is taking place on Indigenous lands across Turtle Island, known as North America. I'm speaking to you from the unceded territories of the Mississaugas of the New Credit to Wendat and Haudenosaunee people in a place called Toronto. We join in the fight for justice, recognizing that there can be no real reconciliation without restitution. That entails seizing the assets of the big resource corporations and returning them to the commons. Tonight's topic is Canada's foreign policy in ruins: China, Israel, Haiti, and Venezuela, featuring Eve Engler of the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute and discussants Grace Rowan, a fourth-year student at Queen's University, and John Orr, president of the Thornhill NDP Federal District Association. Both are members of SA. Eve will speak for about 30 minutes. Grace and John will speak for 6 minutes each. After that, we will take questions written into the chat column from the online audience. So please don't forget to put your questions in. So let's begin. Eve Engler, born in 1979, is a Canadian Montreal-based writer and political activist. In addition to 12, yes, I said 12, published books, Engler's writings have appeared in alternative press and in mainstream publications such as the Globe and Mail, Toronto Star, Ottawa Citizen, and Ecologist. His 2009 book, The Black Book of Canadian Foreign Policy, was shortlisted for the Quebec Writers Federation Mavis Gallant Prize for Nonfiction. His latest book is Stand on Guard for Whom? A People's History of the Canadian Military. So welcome again, Eve.
Thanks a lot. Thanks to SA for putting this on, and thanks for everyone who's tuning in. So I thought I would just kind of go over Canadian foreign policy, maybe start off a little bit with the election, and maybe a bit about what the election campaign and results kind of say about foreign policy. It was a terrible discussion around Canadian foreign policy during the election, would be a first important point. The one issue that got discussed a little bit was Afghanistan, but the whole discussion around Afghanistan was not about that Canada had been part of a terrible, devastating war for 13 years, 40,000 Canadians that fought in Afghanistan, that, over 100,000 civilians dead, incredible destruction. Instead, it was all about how can we get the people who aided our troops' occupation, how can we get them into Canada or get them out of the country? And I of course, I think it's, people who want to leave, people who are scared they might get targeted by the Taliban. Obviously, I think Canada should open up its doors to those people. But underlying the whole kind of discussion is this idea of kind of benevolent Canada. These are the people who supported the good guys, us, right? And that was across the political spectrum, from the Greens, NDP, Conservatives, took shots at the Liberals for not doing enough to get more Afghans out of the country. One issue, foreign policy, military issue that I sort of expected or certainly hoped that might get some attention, because it's been kind of bubbling up at the activist level, was the fighter jet purchase. Canada purchasing 88 new fighter jets for $19 billion, something like $77 billion over the life cycle. A few weeks before the election, there was a a public letter signed by many prominent individuals like Neil Young and David Suzuki that the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute released on the fighter jet issue. So there was a little hope that it would, actually get discussed a little bit during election campaign, and it was basically complete silence. Even the Green Party failed to put it into their platform. The NDP endorsed it, the fighter jet purchase. So that was a bit disappointing. Other things like Canada losing its bid for a seat on the United Nations Security Council last summer, that didn't basically get discussed at all during the election campaign. So the world rejecting Canada's foreign policy was basically excluded from the discussion. A couple of things with regards to the results that were a little bit interesting or disappointing. One was Paul Manley, probably the best MP on foreign policy issues, Green MP in Vancouver Island and Nanaimo. He was unfortunately defeated. The NDP MPs that are better on foreign policy, people like Nikki Ashton, Leah Gazan, Matthew Green, they all got reelected. So that was a good thing. Unfortunately, the NDP defense critic, who's very pro-military, Randall Garrison, he also got reelected. I think that's a unfortunate development. One interesting development with regards to the Conservatives was 3 Conservative MPs that represented heavily Chinese Canadian ridings. 3 of them incumbents lost, and it's now basically widely accepted. Just yesterday or day before, on the front page of the National Post, there was an article about the conservative Chinese pro-conservative Chinese community group that came out and was basically complaining that it was because of the hardline anti-China positions that Erin O'Toole took that it led to the defeat of 3 conservative incumbent MPs in majority Chinese Canadian riding. So that was a positive, I think, rejection of that hardline policy that the Conservatives have taken on supporting the U.S. ramping up its campaign on China. And I'll get to that a bit more further on. Now, so the 4 countries mentioned, I thought I would go into each one a little bit. Beginning with Haiti, and what is really a situation that's going from bad to worse. Just yesterday or the day before, there was a report about 100 people being kidnapped in a neighborhood in Port-au-Prince over that day. Real dissent at a whole bunch of levels, particularly at the level of insecurity. But of course, not that long ago, 2 months ago, I guess it's 3 months ago maybe now, the president was assassinated in the middle of the night. And Jovenel Moïse, assassins came into his house and were able to kill him without anybody else being hurt. Well, his wife was reportedly hurt, but no security injured. So it was definitely an inside job. There was definitely elements of the government, the police apparatus that supported the assassination. And really, it's the culmination of the descent of Haitian political life that Canada is right at the center of controlling or influencing. So while Jovenel Moïse is a very authoritarian, violent individual, obviously a president being assassinated in the middle of the night is not very, very rarely would that be a good thing. And basically the descent of Haitian political life has a number of factors. Basically, what's been in place over the past decade is the PHTK political party that Moïse was part of, set up by Michel Martelly. They're basically mafiosos. They're former Duvalier people, heavily involved in drug dealing, highly corrupt. And Canada's right at the center of the Trudeau government supported Moise throughout the biggest demonstrations anywhere in the world from mid 2018 to the end of 2019. General strikes, multiple general strikes. Trudeau defended Moise in so many different ways, diplomatically, providing policing support that was, keeping Moise in place. There was Canadian Special Forces sent to Haiti at one point. But basically the PHTK, we put them into place after the earthquake. We basically used the weakening of the Haitian state and the Préval government of the time that happened with the earthquake the terrible earthquake in 2010 to put in place Michel Martelly as the president. And we've been backing these former Duvalier types since that time. So the other side to the rise of the PHTK and these sort of mafioso political party that Moise was part of, that ultimately assassinated him. The other side to it is that we destroyed the alternative, right? In 2000, there was the most democratic elections in Haitian history. One political party won more than 70% of 7,000 positions across the country, the Famille Lavalas political party. And we went about doing everything we could to destroy that political party, and ultimately would overthrow the government in 2004 with the US and France. So we've done Canada's responsibility for the descent of Haitian political life is happening at both ends. One, we destroyed the alternative, the progressive pro-poor alternative of the Famille Lavalas and Aristide's movement. On the other hand, we, literally, Canadian officials and through the Organization of American States decided that in the 2010 election that the PHTK, or Michel Martelly specifically, that he should be in the second round of elections with no credible rationale from a ballot counting standpoint, and we put him in place. So the Canadian government has been right at the center of the descent of Haitian political life. One of the main forums in which this takes place is something called the Core Group. After Moise was assassinated, the interim prime minister, Jovenel Moise, had no constitutional legitimacy. His mandate had already expired. So he was a de facto president. But he had an interim prime minister that he had previously appointed, who was a de facto because it wasn't recognized by the parliament, because they never held elections, right? Moise never held elections. So there's 10 elected officials in the whole country. But so the Claude Joseph, who was the interim prime minister that at the time of Moise's assassination, he just a couple of days before, another individual, Ariel Henry, had been appointed by Moise to be the new prime minister, but he hadn't been sworn in yet. And so after Moise's assassination, 3 different individuals claimed being prime minister, which effectively meant president because the actual president was dead. The individual in the Senate, Claude Joseph and Ariel Henry. And how it got decided Ariel Henry was the actual prime minister or head of state effectively was by a press release from the Core Group. The Core Group being ambassadors of the US, France, Canada, Germany, Spain, Brazil, and representative of the OAS, Organization of American States, UN, and European Union. So we're literally like deciding who is the leader of Haiti by press release of foreign ambassadors. And so over the last 17 years, since the 2004 coup, the Core Group has been incredibly influential within Haitian political life. And Canada is obviously one of the members, second most important member of the Core Group after the US. And this is Canada's most nakedly imperialistic alliance. And when the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute sent a questionnaire to all the political parties during the election. The only two parties that got back were the Communist Party and the NDP. But in their response to the questionnaire, one of the questions was, do you support Canadian involvement in the core group? And the answer was a series of different alliances and other questions tied to this. And your options were more, the same, less, or none. The NDP's response was, we wanted the same Canadian contribution to the core group. So here you have a body where it's, as many Haitians on social media point out, with a bunch of white foreigners who basically oversee the country. And the NDP's position was, we want Canada to maintain its position within the core group. So that's just one. Haiti is one example of a very imperialistic Canadian foreign policy. But it's a good starting point to then contrast with another type of Canadian imperialism taking place right now, which is in Venezuela. So in Venezuela, it's the opposite, right? In the case of Haiti, we were propping up an individual that was widely despised. The electoral legitimacy of Jovenel Moïse was incredibly thin. We continued to support him even after the constitutional mandate ended. On the other hand, in Venezuela, it's the opposite. We are involved in this huge campaign to overthrow the president and the government because we say that they don't have enough constitutional legitimacy, even though Nicolas Maduro's constitutional legitimacy is much greater than Jovenel Moïse's constitutional legitimacy ever was. And in fact, we made Haiti became part of the coalition that Canada was leading to try to overthrow Venezuela's government, the so-called Lima Group. Now, this talk is about the ruins of Canadian foreign policy, and clearly in Venezuela, it is the ruins. It's a failure. The Canadian government has failed in its campaign to overthrow Maduro's government. And most obviously, the fact that Maduro is still there, but the Lima Group, this coalition that Canada helped set up in 2017, that Canada basically pushed Peru to instigate the Lima Group, because it's preferable to call it the Lima Group than to call it the Ottawa Group, or maybe then to call it the Washington Group. That would be even more politically bad, even worse public relations. So it was preferred to call it the Lima Group, and it was a coalition of governments that were willing to go along with this campaign to oust Maduro. Now, just before the election, the Canadian federal election, the new Peruvian left-wing government, one of the first things it did was it withdrew from the Lima Group, and it said it was the worst decision in the history of Peruvian foreign policy, being part of the Lima Group. That, of course, got no attention in the Canadian media, so just complete silence from what I can tell in any Canadian media, and the Canada, right at the center of the Lima Group, and when Juan Guaido in early 2019, when he did his self-declaration saying that he was the legitimate president of the country, that Canada was right at the center of pushing, the meeting, the first Lima Group meeting after Juan Guaido declared himself president, that took place in Ottawa, and it was a major media story, right? It was a big story. It was this Canada was doing this great thing to try to overthrow the government in Venezuela, and it was like bringing a coalition together, and even though at that meeting the declaration that came out of it called on the Venezuelan army to, quote, demonstrate their loyalty to the interim president. In other words, it was a very explicit call for the Venezuelan military to overthrow the elected president. So tons of media attention about the Lima Group at the time, and then just more or less silence when Peru ends the Lima Group. Now, in fact, I shouldn't say that was the case during election. Just today, for the first time in a long time, in the Globe and Mail, Konrad Jakubuski, I think is pronounced it, columnist, has a column about Chrystia Freeland. And he says in it, it's not really about Venezuela, but just a short part of it is, he says, quote, Freeland behind the scenes efforts in 2018 and 2019 to apply international pressure to oust Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro through the Lima Group indicated that she was willing to expend Canadian diplomatic capital for good cause. So Yakubuski is boasting about the Lima Group, but doesn't mention the total failure of this policy, and this policy to targeting the Venezuelan government was part of a broader. Canada brought in 4 rounds of sanctions against Venezuela that really legitimated and reinforced the far more devastating U.S. sanctions that have decimated Venezuela's economy. Canada, brought Venezuela to the International Criminal Court, backing opposition groups. In the Canadian Foreign Policy Institute questionnaire regarding the election questionnaire, the NDP's response on a similar question to the core group on the Lima Group of whether Canada should have more, the same, less, or none involvement in the Lima Group, the NDP's response was less. So it's a bit better. They didn't say the same, but they didn't say none, which I would have hoped would have been their position. One element of a failure of Trudeau's foreign policy that deserved a lot more attention, continues to deserve more attention, was Bolivia. I mean, it was a very clear, stark rejection of Canada's role in the 2019 coup against Evo Morales. 1 year later, the Morales' political party, the coup government, kept postponing elections. They said they were going to have elections immediately, like 60 days after the ousting Morales, and then they just kept postponing. Finally, demonstrations and strikes forced them to hold the election, and then Evo Morales' party won by almost a 2-to-1 margin. So it was quite a clear rejection of Canada's role, particularly through the Organization of American States, in supporting the coup in Bolivia. One thing, just an interesting little bit on Bolivia, just a couple of days ago, Bolivia's new foreign trade minister complained that the Canadian government wasn't showing the political will to waive patent rules for a Canadian company that has a contract with the Bolivian government to provide COVID-19 vaccines. And St. Catharines, Ontario-based company called BioLise Pharma has an agreement to manufacture the Johnson & Johnson 1-dose vaccine. And the Canadian government is doing nothing to enable this, to waive the patent rules. As, of course, the pandemic extends, it's still a minority of Bolivians who've been able to get a vaccine. And so I think that one of the from the Canadian government's perspective, the coup against Evo Morales was so there wouldn't be a government in place that would make some sort of demand like this of the Canadian government, that an embarrassing demand that the Canadian government would then just ignore. The point of the coup government was they wouldn't try to put pressure on the Canadian government to bypass patent regulations. But that's one issue. I think that Bolivia is an issue that a clear failure of Trudeau's foreign policy, a clear rejection by Bolivians of Canada's support for a very explicit support for a coup, even if not deeply involved in building up the opposition, or we don't have any details of that. They were quite explicitly supportive diplomatically and through officials to the Organization of American States and funding. In the region, there is a bit of a break from this Organization of American States. There's a pushback against the OAS's far right-wing policy, which is really positive. A couple of weeks ago, Mexico held a conference of the CELAC, which is the community of Latin American and Caribbean countries. So every country in the hemisphere, except for 2 countries, the US and Canada. So the OAS has traditionally excluded Cuba. So CELAC is somewhat of an effort to replace the OAS, or it could be that. And the Mexican foreign minister said that very clearly, that's what they're hoping. And of course, the OAS's heavy involvement in the coup in Bolivia has increased the hostility certainly by the Bolivian government and other left-wing governments. There's also a shift. There's a shift of the right-wing governments that were on the ascendancy are generally weakened, and it looks like they're going to be replaced by more social democratic type governments in Bolivia or in Brazil, probably in Colombia and in Chile. So there's a sort of region-wide rejection of Canada's pro-mining, pro-coup Venezuela, Lima Group kind of policies taking place in the region, which is really good because there was a leftward shift in the region, and then it really kind of went in a far in the other direction. But things seem to be going back in a more progressive direction. Shifting gears to elsewhere in the region, to Israel. Justin Trudeau met with Naftali Bennett, or has spoken to him twice since he became the new Israeli prime minister about 2 weeks ago, I believe, and then back in June. After both calls with Bennett, Trudeau said that he praised Bennett. Bennett, of course, is a far-right politician. He said that Canada and Israel had, quote, shared democratic values. That same language was used in both press releases after the calls. Bennett in 2013 boasted, quote, "I have killed many Arabs in my life, and there's no problem with that." In May, when there was the upsurge of Israeli violence and ethnic cleansing in East Jerusalem, and the minority Palestinian citizens of Israel communities were being targeted by Jewish supremacist thugs, Bennett actually came two individuals who were arrested for killing a Palestinian citizen of Israel. He came to their defense publicly, and he blamed. He said that he flipped it around, so it was actually the minority Palestinian citizens of Israel that were responsible for the religious or racial kind of violence. He said, quote, "The government had to immediately ensure the safety of the families besieged in their homes for fear of Arab mobs." So that's the shared values. That's the type of politician we're supporting in Israel. I see that I only have 5 minutes left, and I do want to get to China, so I'm going to try to go through the Israel stuff quickly. But Trudeau has really just continued this incredibly pro-Zionist policy of the Canadian government. Just yesterday, he had this speech to a big Swedish anti-Semitism forum, where he confirmed Erwin Kotler as a special envoy, strident anti-Palestinian. He said that we reinforced the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition, which targets pro-Palestinian activism. And at this forum, he said that the far right and the far left were both equally intolerant. So explicitly saying that, those movements who have historically fought for equality and equal rights for all are no different than the far right, racist, often fascistic forces. So it's a really extreme example of, in the service of Palestinian oppression, completely flipping reality on its head. And there's many facets to the pro-Israel policy: anti-Palestinian votes at the UN, boasting Canadians that are fighting in the Israeli military. The ambassador, I guess about 2 years ago now, had a pizza party for Canadians fighting in the Israeli military. So Trudeau has really continued with a hard line anti-Palestinian policy, which continues right up until a new example of that yesterday. With regards to China, we are going towards a incredible global conflict on U.S. effort to stunt China's rise to a major economy and a major global power. And it's really a fascinating, I don't have the time to get into it all, but it is a fascinating battle going on around the militaristic empire-focused forces and the corporate forces, right? It's a bizarre situation where I'm aligned with the head of McKinsey, a big global capitalist consultancy firm, Dominic Barton, Canada's ambassador to China. The preference is to be with the hardline capitalists versus the military industrial complex element of political life. And so this growing conflict with China is picking up, and Americans are doing so many different things to ramp things up. And Canada's heavily involved. The Liberal Party is split. In some ways, the Liberal Party is actually better than the NDP, certainly better than the Conservatives on this issue, better than the NDP. The Liberal Party split between the pro-US and then the pro-capitalist kind of forces going on. Obviously, the whole arrest of Meng Wanzhou was and her release. Just that was all part of the U.S. campaign against Huawei and to contain China. The Wall Street Journal on Friday had a front page article titled "America Set Out to Hobble Huawei and it Succeeded," and it starts off with the arrest of Meng and then talks about how they've been able to just really undercut Huawei's global rise. That's what this was. The arrest was all about. That was clear pretty much right from the start. Despite that, Trudeau went along with it. Just in a couple of days ago, a Canadian naval vessel was part of what the CBC headline, quote, "A joint naval exercise in the Pacific sent a stark warning to China." So the US-led naval exercise, 17 countries. And then after this exercise, a handful of the countries, including the Canadian vessel, went through the South China Sea as what is viewed as very much as a provocative maneuver. I have to wrap up. So what I'll just end with is that, part of what's the anti-China force in this country, they really center around is the whole Five Eyes, right? This Five Eyes intelligence alliance of the US, France, or US, Canada, Australia, Britain, and New Zealand, right? The former British colonies, the countries that the four countries that didn't sign the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, those are part of the Five Eyes. It's basically a European colonial, Anglo-colonial alliance, and this is what we're the whole targeting China is right at the center of this, and it needs to be denounced. The racism of that needs to be denounced. But yeah, just to wrap up, I think that the election that we just came out of, there wasn't much foreign policy, but we do the circumstances. If we do organize, having a minority government dependent on either the NDP or the Bloc, those are in recent history, those are the best kind of macro level political circumstances we can have to get things to have some success. So if we can organize ourselves, we can get rekindle the anti-war movement. We can rekindle or can build up some anti-imperialist activism. The possibilities of having an impact on policy is greater than in most other circumstances. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Eve. Thank you so very much. Our first discussant is Grace Rowan. She is a new member of Socialist Action and a fourth-year student of psychology at Queen's University. She has been politically involved on campus through work in mental health, mutual aid, environmental justice, and advocacy for the local prison population. So welcome, Grace.
Thank you. I'm going to be doing a little talk on Israel and specifically two parts, our foreign policy and our support of the two-state solution. So, sorry, I'm not techie, so just 1 second. I'm figuring out how to minimize. Okay, I hope that worked. So, in the words of our Foreign Affairs Minister, Mark Garneau, Canada believes in the creation of a Palestinian state living side by side in peace and security with Israel. The creation of a Palestinian state, in his words, can only be achieved through direct negotiation between parties. So that's basically the idea of the two-state solution. So basically, Canada's official stance is that the two-party solution would be nice and that is for Israel and Palestine to figure out. So while they figure that out, this is where they currently stand. Israel holds all of the power, controls resources and wealth, one of the biggest military spenders and arms dealers in the world, 170,000 active members, full Navy and Air Force, sophisticated missiles, nuclear weapons, etc. In contrast, Palestinians face many restrictions and are continuing to be displaced from their homes or worse as Israel expands its control and land theft. And in terms of military, there are 30 to 50,000 total members in scattered troops with no air force or boats or sophisticated weaponry or defense. Their only designated body of defense is a security force funded by the US and EU and corrupted by the IDF. So with these contrasting conditions in mind, it is clear why multiple human rights organizations and experts have concluded that this is an apartheid. And this does not fit the narrative of two sides that can figure it out together, as such a narrative requires a conflict rather than a one-sided oppression. So it is thus not surprising that the Liberal government categorically rejects the apartheid label, in the words of Garneau. So, which I know I'm probably mispronouncing. So the motivation for this denial is clear. If this is a right and wrong situation, which it is, the Canadian government is firmly on the wrong side. If we look at our foreign policy, that's pretty clear to see. So, for example, we have abundant financial ties to Israel. So most obviously, we have the Canada-Israel Free Trade Agreement, the CIFTA, which is the first foreign trade agreement that we made outside of North America. And then we modernized that recently in 2019. So over $1 billion of trade occurred between Canada and Israel in 2018 alone, with over 500 million total exports to Israel. And in 2019, Canada sent $13.7 million just in military goods and technology specifically. So it's just a very clear look at how we're directly choosing a side in that. And then tax deductible charitable donations are another way that we give a lot of money to Israel. So in 2018, which is the same year that we exported $500 million, registered Canadian charities raised over $250 million for Israel-focused projects. And since the federal government introduced deductions for charities in 1967, billions of dollars, in 1991, it was estimated at 100 to 200 million per year and has increased since then. And subsidized donations have gone to Israel. So the Canadian government supposedly restricts registered charities from supporting other countries' militaries. It's directly outlined that we cannot support, is not charitable to support other country militaries. However, numerous registered charities still support the Israeli military, the IDF. Furthermore, many legal experts believe that organizations that support or enable the military occupation of Palestinian land should also be excluded from receiving taxpayer subsidies. Regardless of this, assuming $100 million was sent to Israel annually since 1967, which is on the low end, with estimated 30% of the $5.4 billion total subsidized by taxpayers, there's apparently a $1.7 billion in Canadian public support estimated for these charitable donations to a country that has similar GDP to our own. So this, coupled with the trade that I outlined before, shows a bit of our financial ties and our financial contributions, and even specifically to the military. And then furthermore, we also have lots of other foreign policy that jumps through hoops for Israel. So for example, there were legal battles and policy loopholes that were strategically used to allow the sale of food and drink that is made in illegal Israeli settlements on Palestinian land, labeled Made in Israel, financially legitimizing occupied land and resources that our government supposedly does not recognize, but they do for the case of the taxes and tariffs on those products. And furthermore, Canada has opposed the International Crimes Court, the ICC, from exercising jurisdiction over serious crimes committed in occupied Palestinian territory, even after the ICC prosecutor opened a formal probe into these abuses. So that's just a very brief overview. But to review, the government stance is that the two-state solution would be nice and that the two states need to work that out themselves. However, they also only recognize one of the sides as being a state. And the reality is that one side is an oppressive military superpower with total control of the land and resources. And the supposed conflict that needs to be worked out is an act of apartheid. So the Canadian government refuses to acknowledge this reality in order to continue to support the imbalance of power through contributions to Israel's markets and even the IDF directly. So then the question is, why won't the two-state solution work? Why is that bad that they are hiding behind that in their actions? So for one, many argue it never would have worked. So in the words of Ghada Karmi, who I'm going to be pulling on very heavily, he's a British Palestinian author and lecturer at Exeter University's Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies. So Israelis never intended to comply with Resolution 242, in his words, which ordered the withdrawal of Israeli forces from Palestinian land. So in support of the stance, Karmi points to the steady colonization of Palestinian land that was not halted or even slowed after this resolution was passed. And in fact, this resolution has been used to justify further seizure of Palestinian land. Israel argued that the lack of sovereign rule from either side over the land they seized during the war left these territories neither occupied nor not occupied, and then used the vague language of the resolution to their advantage. There's also the issue of right of return. So as Karmi explains, there's the basic issue to resolve this conflict, and that is right of return. Following the 1967 war, Israel expelled 400 to 500,000 Palestinians from their homes, and present day, Israel authorities expropriate Palestinian land and demolish homes regularly to expand and create new illegal settlements. 75,000 Palestinians have been displaced since May, and over 5 million Palestinian refugees are currently registered worldwide. So a two-state solution does not address the Palestinian people's basic right of return. And experts believe that as Palestinian collective trauma is rooted in forced displacement, a strong sense of Palestinian identity and security may depend on directly addressing these initial and ongoing displacements and its consequences. Then the possibly most relevant issue is the issue of control, which Israel holds completely. So as Karmi explains, the fact of total Israeli control of 100% of Palestine is precisely and fundamentally why you cannot have a two-state solution. All of these previous considerations have been entirely hypothetical and impossible. Israeli citizens enjoy many privileges under the status quo, and their complete domestic control coupled with complicity from the international community means they're able to retain and expand these privileges without exploring genuine peace considerations. So as put by one expert, genuine supporters of the two-state solution fail to acknowledge facts on the ground, that the system between Jordan River and Mediterranean Sea is a one-state reality, an apartheid state where one community has all of the privileges of citizenship, while the other community is deprived of its fundamental human rights. And I think I have 1 minute left, so I'm just going to wrap it up. So basically, those are some reasons why the two-state solution wouldn't work. But in summary, it doesn't matter because we've only really used it as an excuse to not legitimize Palestine as a state so that they don't have the right to assent to different treaties and rules that we have set out for states. And in summary, the reality is there's one state, an apartheid state, and the international support that Palestinians desperately require from our foreign policy cannot be distracted from by false claims of this two-state future. That's it.
Okay, thank you very much, Grace. Our next discussant is John Orritt. He is a retired district chief with Toronto Fire Services and a longtime member of Socialist Action. He has an honors BA in political science, York University, and is a frequent contributor to Turn Left magazine. Currently, John is president of the Thornhill Federal NDP. Welcome, John.
Hello, everyone. Canadian foreign policy decisions are taken in the interests of the capitalist class. They clearly mirror our position in the world as a junior partner of American imperialism. There's an old adage, you're known by the company you keep. Let's look at Canada's membership and participation in global forums. As a member of the United Nations, our vote in crucial matters aligns with the United States. And this is even when the United States and Canada are in a small minority. In the Organization of American States, Canada defends the interests of transnational corporations against nationalist movements to gain control and ownership of local resources, production, and infrastructure. This includes active participation in the overthrow of elected government in Haiti, intervening and promoting the failed illegitimate coup in Venezuela, and doing precious little when legitimate governments are overthrown, as in Morales in Bolivia and 10 years ago with Zelaya in Honduras. Canada's elite have always been willing participants in the world's economic institutions that aim to preserve and maintain the international capitalist system. Canada participated in the 1944 Bretton Woods Conference that set up the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. Over time, these institutions served to impose austerity on developing nations. Third world debt became unmanageable, and balanced budgets were insisted upon for further loans. In the guise of structural reform, nations were forced to sell public assets to private investors. Meanwhile, the voting power at the World Bank and the IMF remains with the US and their capitalist allies. Canada also belongs to the G7, the elite of the elite, and the G20, which is a sub-elite, both organizations dedicated to propping up capitalism. The foreign affairs of states are always heavily focused on trade relations, how to secure stable export and import markets. Canada was a signatory to the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which is morphed into the World Trade Organization. But to lower even further trade barriers to corporate trade, our corporate elite has cajoled our government into negotiating other more extensive agreements like the US-Mexico-Canada Agreement, the Canada-Europe Comprehensive Trade Agreement, and the Trans-Pacific Partnership. All of these are not just about trade. They're really about seeking to cement the rights of private corporations. They enhance the rights of private service providers over public service. The dispute resolution arbitration can overturn government decisions. Non-corporate discrimination articles make public ownership of production and infrastructure more difficult to attain. These agreements seek to extend patent protection, and to its shame, Canada at the World Trade Organization has voted to not give emergency exemption to COVID patents, and this has caused many more unnecessary deaths in the world. To summarize, Canada's role in trade agreements and trade institution is to strengthen the role of transnational corporations and capitalism around the world. Now, the second pillar of foreign policy beyond trade is defense or military policy. Clausewitz's famous aphorism is that war is the continuation of politics by other means. As socialists, we really don't like this statement because we envision a world of solidarity and common interest. But in a world dominated by rapacious capitalism, it's somewhat of a truism. For Canada, defense policy is determined through our membership in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. NATO was formed in 1949 and Canada was a founding member. Purportedly formed as a bloc to thwart the Warsaw Pact, NATO is in fact expansionary. It now has 30 members, and it's aggressive with incursions and invasions of other countries thousands of miles distant from the North Atlantic. The first big operation was in Korea. This was a UN-sponsored, US-led interference in what was basically a civil war for reunification. It was during the Korean War that NATO truly began to develop its infrastructural forces and strategy. 26,000 Canadians participated in Korea with 516 casualties, but we had no business being there. The peninsula itself is still in ruins, with a resumption of hostilities a threat to global peace. In 1956, NATO nations actually came to loggerheads over the Suez Crisis. France, the UK, and Israel invaded the Sinai, and Egypt sued for peace. The United Nations did not support its NATO allies, and Canada was called upon to anchor a UN peacekeeping force. The beneficial results of this peacekeeping is pure Canadian mythology. When Egyptian President Gamal Nasser ordered the peacekeepers out in 1967, the Six-Day War immediately erupted and ended up with a tragic loss for Arab and Palestinian peoples. To this day, there's no lasting peace in the Middle East because there is no justice. In 1973, Canada was the United States' choice as their representative to the International Control Commission to implement the Geneva Accords in Vietnam. This failed, but only after Canadian defense contractors made millions of dollars in armament supply contracts, and close to 30,000 Canadians volunteered under the US flag. In 1974, a NATO nation was actually invaded. It was invaded by another NATO nation, Turkey. That was in Cyprus. And Canada was called in again to be a peacekeeper. But there has been no lasting peace in Cyprus. The island is still divided. Peacekeepers can only divide hostile forces, but they cannot solve economic and social inequality. In 1999, the US President Clinton orchestrated the NATO bombing of Serbia to continue the dismemberment of the former Yugoslavia. No NATO nation was ever attacked. Bill's wife, Hillary Clinton, proved most adept at filling her husband's shoes as Secretary of State to President Obama when she organized CIA deception and subterfuge with the NATO bombings of Libya in 2011. The NATO Air Command was actually under Canadian Lieutenant General Charles Bouchard, who 3 years after retiring told the CBC, quote, he hoped more would have been done to support the Libyan people in their transition towards democracy. Too late, crocodile tears. Canada is spending billions on new fighter jets. These monies represent the interests of the hugely distorted North American armaments industry. The light armored vehicles exported by General Dynamics to Saudi Arabia are produced in Canada, but by a subsidiary of an American multinational. Canada's banking interests in South America, mining interests in Africa are just some examples of how we are tied into protecting the capitalist system and all its institutions and protocols. The system is destroying the habitability of the planet and impoverishing all working people. It needs to be replaced by international socialism based on solidarity and common interest. And this is what Socialist Action tries to do. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Okay, so thanks, Eve and Grace as well. And now, with the help of our technical producer, Daniel, we are going to go to our online audience. And I think we have 10 or 11 questions. We're going to do 9 for sure, and hopefully get all 11 in if we can. So go ahead, Daniel, with the first 3 questions, and the lineup will be, let's see, it is, we're going to start with Grace. Okay, and you have 4 minutes. So read the questions, Daniel.
Yeah, thank you, Elizabeth, and thanks to everybody. Wonderful remarks. I had a great time listening in. First question was directed towards Eve, but like always, anybody can also weigh in on it. It goes, is Canada's foreign policy written in the US State Department and sent to Ottawa as marching orders? Or does the Canadian government make its own foreign policy in keeping with the ruling class's imperialist interests, which in many but not all cases are aligned with those of the United States? The second question, if Canada's foreign policy is in ruins, what can the Trudeau Liberal government do next on China, Afghanistan, Palestine, and Venezuela without appearing as an abject slave to Washington? And what role can NDP have in this? And the third question, does Canada really support women in Afghanistan?
Okay, thank you, Daniel. So we're going to go to Grace, then to John, and then to Eve. And you have up to 4 minutes to answer 1, 2, or 3, or none if you feel that way. Grace.
So I don't have expertise for a lot of that, or like pretty much any of it. So I'll just have a very brief answer for number 2. Just for what Canada's foreign policy can do to be improved in terms of Palestine. I think like there's many different strategies that could be argued, but there's a very clear first step, which is that we are actively putting support and actively going through loopholes in our foreign policy to allow support of the IDF and support of Israel's markets. And I think that like the first step that we would have is just to at least hold to the stance that our government has said, which is that for one, like occupied Palestine lands that is illegal Israeli settlements, that those are not recognized by foreign policy, and two, that we are not contributing to at least the power imbalance financially in the ways that we are. I think that's a very bare minimum first step approach.
Okay, thank you, Grace. John?
Wow. Okay, for the what to do in different places. In China, first we should get out of NATO, and we should get out of, not involve ourselves in any provocative military maneuvers in the South China Sea. That's the first thing. You know, some of our trade deals have been particularly anti-China. The TPP is actually written up to exclude China. There's no need really to do that. I don't know how we can stop the rhetoric that's in the press. We have somewhat of a free press, but the rhetoric in the press is just going crazy. Why are we so interested all of a sudden in the freedom of the Uyghurs and all these other maneuvers? It's crazy. In Afghanistan, what can we do? Get people who want to leave, try to leave, but we should try to create the best conditions we can by perhaps giving as much foreign aid as we can, but just out. It's not our affair. Venezuela, stop the sanctions. Break the sanctions. Trade with Venezuela. Break with the Lima group and say, we will come, Canada. We will help you get your oil fields going. We have expertise. We will help Venezuela. In Palestine, we need a single state solution. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Okay, Eve?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll go maybe backwards a little bit here, but with Afghanistan, I think that Canada didn't invade to help women in Afghanistan. Were there some benefits to some women, and did the propaganda that was used to justify the occupation have some spillover benefits for girls going to school or women? I think it probably did in some situations, maybe in Kabul and in the cities to a certain extent. I'm not sure it's a good idea to connect foreign occupation with feminism. From feminism's perspective, long term in Afghanistan, I don't think that is necessarily a very good idea. So yeah, we built schools. There were schools that were built for girls. Those schools were built to justify Canada's military occupation. With regards to the other questions, I mean, the first question around, like, is it written in the State Department? It's a difficult question. So, because you got to go from issue to issue. The Canadian government provides incredible support for mining companies around the world. We rewrite countries' mining codes. Our diplomats, much of what they do on a day-to-day basis is supporting mining companies. We provide aid funding for just mining engineering, mining education, because Canadian mining companies are so dominant that tends to, having more people who have the skills in Ethiopia, for instance, that's going to end up benefiting Canadian mining companies. So there's incredible efforts done by the Canadian government to support the mining sector around the world. And often when those mining companies are engaged in all kinds of abuses, I have not seen any evidence that pressure from Washington has contributed to Canada's pushing of mining companies, abuse of mining companies around the world. I've seen zero evidence of that. That is something that is being done by the Canadian government because there's a lot of corporations in this country. Some of the capital comes from elsewhere. It's not all Canadian capital, but as much as 75% of the world's mining companies are listed or based in Canada. I mean, Canada's 0.5% of the world's population. It's so out of proportion with our role, our size in the world. So the mining sector is an example where there's seen basically no evidence that it's written by the State Department. Well, now you take a different issue. You take something like Venezuela. I think clearly the State Department is influencing Canadian policy towards Venezuela fairly significantly. I think it's probably fair to say that part of why Chrystia Freeland took on such an aggressive anti-Venezuela policy was tied to the negotiations of NAFTA, the renegotiation of a trade agreement with the U.S. and Mexico, and it was being done in alliance with Washington, with the State Department. At a macro level, my understanding of Canadian foreign policy is that there's two forces driving Canadian foreign policy: particular Canadian corporate interests, or Canadian capitalist class corporate interests, and support for empire, historically British, today US. Most of day-to-day diplomacy is driven by corporate interests. The big issues, like going to war, is driven by our relationship with the US. The Canadian military is deeply, deeply tied in with the US military. The Canadian military industrial complex, the companies producing weaponry in Canada are often branch plants of US companies. So you have to look at the issues really closely, but yes, the US has a lot of influence. Now, I know I don't have much time left, but I do want to make this one point. It's important also to contrast. Some people suggest it's just because of Canadian trade relations with the US. I don't think I think that's a mistake to be that simplistic, because look at Mexico, right? Mexico is more dependent on trade with the US than Canada is. Mexico has a far less damaging foreign policy and a far less pro-US foreign policy than Canada has, right? So it's clearly not just a question of economic dependence because of a free trade agreement. There's other elements, there's racial elements, there's linguistic elements, there's connections between the capitalist class in Canada and the US, and deep, long historical connections, military-industrial complex questions, et cetera, et cetera. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay, so we go back to Daniel for 3 more questions, and this time you will also get 4 minutes, and the lineup will be John, Eve, and Grace. Daniel?
First, before I go to the next 3 questions, I want to just highlight a fun comment that Anthony made with respect to John. Who is this guy? How does the capitalist NDP tolerate him? Anyways, I'm glad it does. It should promote him. And I agree. John Orrit should have more of a say in the NDP. Good foreign policy. So the first question of our next block was directed towards Eve, but as always, other people can weigh in. How can we best support locally based groups in Haiti, donations or otherwise? The second question, is there a slight shift in Ottawa's policy on the 2-state solution in Israel and Palestine, saying that 2 states, which is a widely discredited policy, especially here, is only a preferred route? And the third question is, what will increase awareness among Canadians to make foreign policy a ballot box issue?
Okay, John, you have 4 minutes to answer 1, 2, or 3.
I'm on Haiti. I'm going to leave that to Eve. I really don't know how we've interfered in a way of sending aid or donations or whatever. I like Médecins Sans Frontières for I give aid to them, money to them. But well, really, how we can do it is change our government. Have a government in there that really wants to help Haiti, that actually wants to give aid, not leech money out, not support maquiadoros who pay their citizens next to nothing. So that's the best way is to change the government, have a socialist government in Canada. Is there a shift in the Mideast? No, not really. I don't think so. How to increase awareness among Canadians to make foreign policy a ballot issue? I don't know. We had 2 big issues going on during this election: the Meng Wanzhou affair and the 2 Michaels affair, and we had Afghanistan going on. If that doesn't enliven Canadian interest in foreign affairs, I really don't know what would do such, other than maybe some bombing on Canadian soil. But as regards the Meng affair, it shows that Canadian policy is not made here. In many instances, it took a decision by President Biden to have a Canadian citizen released in Canadian soil and a Chinese citizen released from house arrest. not a decision by Prime Minister Trudeau, nothing to do with it. So, and then the other issue, of course, with Afghanistan going on. I could just say 20 years ago in the fire hall, I used to tell my fellow workers, nothing as good is going to come out of Afghanistan. Nothing good. We're not going to liberate women in Afghanistan. We're going to eventually retreat like so many other countries have over so many centuries, and we're going to leave Afghanistan in even a worse mess than they were. We don't like that. That's very sad that the Taliban is back in power, but our foreign policy did nothing to stop that from happening. So people just have to wake up and start paying attention to foreign policy.
Thank you, John. Eve?
With regards to the shift, I saw that there was an article from Peter Larson with the Palestine, Ottawa, get the name of the group there in Ottawa, Canadian Palestine Talks or something. I thought he was making a little too much of a very brief comment, but it's possible. I'm doubtful because the Trudeau government has, continued forward with this over the top pro-Israel policy. In terms of Haiti, I mean, there has been some efforts to rekindle some Haiti solidarity activism in Canada. Obviously, here in Montreal, we have Solidarité Québec Haiti that does stuff, and there's also another Haitian community group that's been doing stuff. In terms of funding groups in Haiti, I have had a list after the earthquake that was circulating around. If someone emails me, just evingler@hotmail.com, I can send that list to them. I don't think that that's ultimately the solution. The solution is Canada getting out of the core group. I think that should be the central demand of Haiti solidarity activism in this country, because it's a flagrantly imperialistic alliance. It was set up right after the coup in 2004. So it's also educational. So talking about the core group is also about educating people about what Canada did to overthrow the government in 2004. And it's directly relevant. I mean, people in Haiti are regularly protesting the core group and denouncing it. And so it's a very concrete demand that should be pushed. I know the Caribbean, Kevin Edmonds, who's in Toronto with the Caribbean Solidarity Network, I believe. They've been putting out a bit of stuff on the core group. He had an article a couple of days ago that was published on it. Now, how do you make a foreign policy a ballot box issue? That is a really difficult question. I mean, we tried the last election in 2019 with the Disruption Network Canada, where we disrupted the many ministers and MPs public events around Palestine, around Venezuela, around climate crisis. And, we had a bit of success in terms of forcing the media to cover some of these things and getting the message out a little bit. So I think that's something that should be, replicated. The pandemic, of course, made that very difficult. That sort of changed the whole dynamic there. Obviously, it's something. Ultimately, it's something much more structural and fundamental. We need to build up organizations, media outlets that are willing to discuss foreign policy from a perspective that challenges power. Right, the dominant media, it's a very narrow spectrum that's allowed in the dominant media. So it's mostly not just like a short-term thing that we can do just before an election. It's something that we have to, has to be broader shift to the political culture. I think there are some short-term things alongside disrupting cabinet ministers or MPs events with foreign policy issues. I think, for instance, the Palestine Solidarity Movement should target one riding to defeat a Liberal MP, should have targeted one riding to defeat a Liberal MP for how bad their policy on Palestine. We did something like that in 2006 on Haiti here in Montreal, where we helped defeat then Foreign Affairs Minister Pierre Pettigrew for his terrible policy on Haiti. We put up 2,000 posters in his riding, handed out 15,000 leaflets, and just pumped critical stuff about what they were doing in Haiti into that riding, and it impacted. Both La Presse and Le Devoir reported on it. I think there are some places, I think that international solidarity moves need to be conscious of that we aren't very powerful. If we could impact one riding, the Palestine Solidarity Movement, much more powerful than the Haiti Solidarity Movement was. If we can impact one riding, that would have some political effect. So there's some strategic things like that I think that we can do. Some of those efforts were done with I Vote Palestine and stuff like that. But I think there's some other elements that we should think about in going forward. But mostly it's about more broadly shifting the political culture.
Thank you, Eve. Grace?
Yeah, I think that pretty much it's been said what I would say, but in terms of number two, I haven't seen any proof of that I've seen that I thought was convincing, but I also haven't read that article, so I'm not sure. I've just seen like a very stout stance for that two-state solution in the past. And then for three, what will increase awareness among Canadians to make foreign policy a ballot box issue? I think like one of the things that we obviously need for that is just like consciousness of the international world, of what's going on outside of our country, and for people to have the capacity to care about what's going on outside of our country. And I think that that's happened a lot with social media in recent years, with being able to see videos going around or read firsthand accounts from people, and just those things can spread really quickly now, and then people can be very invested in international events. And then to couple with that, social media also allows independent media, or media that's going to go, like Eve said, against the power. And I think what gets people to the polls is when they're angry or when they want to go against something that is already occurring. So I think the key would be figuring out what horrible foreign policy we do have that we need to stop, or we need to fix, or we need to get rid of, or how it's affecting people. And that would, I think social media is a big thing that would help with both of these things, of seeing, bringing attention to progressives that know like these foreign policy issues and can bring attention to them. And then also just seeing what is happening and how that foreign policy is affecting other countries, and bringing that weight to the conversation.
Thank you, Grace. Okay, we're going to go back to Daniel for the next three questions, and you will be given 4 minutes again to answer 1, 2, or 3, or none. And the lineup will be Eve, John, and Grace. Okay.
The first question for the last round: how important is the Canadian arms industry versus the Canadian mining industry in influencing Canadian foreign policy? The second question is: how can we act to combat Canada's opposition to China and support for the new Cold War against that great economic power? And the third question is: the Lima Group lost Lima, Argentina, and Bolivia, but Canada remains. What is the purpose of Canada remaining in the Lima Group?
Okay, Eve, 4 minutes.
There is no purpose at this point. I think that with regards to Lima Group, they're never going to admit it. They're never going to end it officially. It's just not going to continue. That would be my guess. The Cold War question is a big one with regards to China. There was effort, the Free Mengzhou campaign that was designed to take one piece of the big conflict and try to lessen tensions through that piece. I think that was a important campaign, but I think we need to talk about it. I mean, the media has done a job on framing China as this great enemy, and it being the aggressor and all that kind of stuff. So public opinion, it's somewhat tied into the pandemic. Public opinion has clearly soured on China. That has been successful. So it's important that people try to provide a alternative. I mean, China is an authoritarian place that is powerful, and I don't think we need to defend the China. I mean, there's billionaire class is monstrous. There's way too much coal use. There's many problems within China. And I don't think we need to defend China as a the model of what we want or anything like that. But I think we do need to push back on just the over the top and explain to people that, the U.S. has bases, military bases surrounding China. I mean, it's incredible. Canadian troops continue to be in South Korea. That comes out of trying to combat the Chinese Revolution 1949, the whole Korean War. That's the roots of it. Now, the question about the arms industry versus the mining industry is an interesting one. The Canadian foreign policy is, I would venture to guess in maybe 50, 70 countries of this world is basically just how do we help mining companies, right? In most countries in Africa, most of what Canadian foreign policy is just how do we help mining companies. Now, so there's degrees, in the US, Canadian policy in the US is probably like, 0.5% of what it is helping Canadian mining companies. There's actually billions of dollars of Canadian mining investment in the US, it's a major sector, but there's so many other elements to the relationship. With regards to the arms industry, it's important to recognize with regards to the arms industry and its influence is that the Defense Production Sharing Agreement that Canada signed with the US, I think in 1956, part of the objective from the American, basically what it did, it made it that Canadian arms manufacturers were able to sell to the Pentagon and basically were treated as if they were American arms manufacturers. So they had a huge market that opened up, the biggest market in the world, the Pentagon, of course. Part of why the U.S. Signed this agreement was so I should just say what that means is that we don't even know exports to the U.S. We don't even quantify Canadian military exports to the U.S. Right? It's just considered So it's just not quantified. We don't even have the data of exact numbers. The Canadian government doesn't announce that. Part of the objective of the Defense Production Sharing Agreement from the US perspective was to bring Canadian foreign policy, military policy, more in alignment with the US. It was a way of throwing a bone to Canadian arms manufacturers to have them become basically a lobby for US military policy within Canada. So the arms industry is tied, obviously it's tied to the military as well, Canadian military, which is obviously very, powerful. So it's hard to kind of disassociate what is the military, what is the arms industry, what is US military policy, because it's kind of all sort of integrated. So yeah, it's hard to to say whether it's the mining sector or the arms industry. The mining sector is much bigger. Canadian mining global, we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars. So it's much bigger, but both are clearly very influential over Canadian foreign policy.
Thank you, Eve. John?
Okay, arms and mining. The armament industry, I believe, has to be continuously supported because people don't viscerally like the arms industry. You talk to Canadians and tell them that we're sending armored vehicles to Saudi Arabia, they really don't like that. If you tell them we're spending 88 millions on attack fighter jets instead of firefighter bombing planes, they really don't like that. You can talk them on a personal level and say, no, this is wrong. The same thing with the mining industry. People viscerally don't really like the mining industry because they know it's exploitative. They know that there's people working all over South America and Africa for a pittance. People know it's polluting. And the mining industry also has this certain anti-indigenous bend to it. The mines are often on indigenous people's land. So it's not hard to get Canadians agreeing to curtail the arms and mining industry. It's a question of how politically can we go about doing it? And again, I'm going to go back to just saying we need to change the government, get a socialist government in power. How to strike a balance, the xenophobia. We've got Russophobia going on here a lot as well. the argument against this is, hey, we're politicking and working here in Canada. We're in North America, and our major allies in Europe. We've got a lot of problems to deal with right here. Let's work on them. Finally, Socialist Action will continue these webcasts, but we're looking forward to holding in-person meetings. And when we do hold our in-person meetings, we usually always have Eve Engler, our good friend Eve Engler's books for sale at our book table. So we're looking forward to having in-person meetings where these books in short supply will be available to you. So I'm looking forward to in the near future for in-person meetings and seeing everybody, and perhaps in the not too long having Eve here as well, promoting another book tour. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. There's nothing like a pause for the cause, and we certainly want to advertise Eve's books, that's for sure. Okay, Grace?
I actually don't feel like I have any really good answers to those questions. I think they covered it really well, so I'm all good.
Okay. All right, so we got a couple of minutes. You're our guest speaker, Eve. Any last words for us?
No, I mean, I think it's kind of the same message of, it's about organizing. It's about mobilizing. There's no shortcuts. When it comes to Canadian foreign policy, if we would have had the very unlikely scenario of never happened before, NDP federal government, I think it would have been a bit better than Trudeau's foreign policy, but I don't think it would have been fundamentally different. It's something that's deep within the political culture, right? There's structural forces. We've mentioned some of the mining sector, the arms industry, the whole think tank world. I mean, all the foreign policy think tanks, pretty much all of them, are vast majority are getting their money from the arms companies, from the mining companies, from the banks. Canadian banking is a huge player around the world, and so there's deep structural explanations for these policies, and there's obviously between where we are today and where we might want to be. There's many small victories that can be had. There's many mitigating, make things less bad, if you like, that can be done, so I think that we need to have be focused on one hand, Canada out of the core group. Canada getting out of the core group in Haiti is not going to change the fact that Haiti is at the bottom of the totem pole in global imperialism. That's not even getting even that what would be a fairly significant victory, but it's going to be one step in allowing Haitians to figure things out for themselves, to maybe make a slightly better country. So I think we need to be involved in a mix of specific campaigns that can make things a little bit better or make things a little bit less bad, if you want to frame it that way, while simultaneously keeping our eyes on broader changes to the economic and political system, and moving beyond capitalism and economic democracy, and challenging colonial dispossession, and things like land back, and so the macro kind of political vision, but yeah, nothing will get done unless we do the work to make it happen.
Okay, thank you very much, Eve. A special thanks, of course, also to Grace and to John and Daniel, our technical producer here in Toronto. So please consider being a supporter of Socialist Action newspaper, which we will send to you online to fill out the form. Just visit our website at www.socialistaction.ca. If you would like to talk to us about joining SA, write to Socialist Action, socialistactioncanada@gmail.com, or just give us a call at 647-986-1917. And once again, folks, if you like this show, please subscribe to the Socialist Action YouTube channel. The next essay webcast will be on Thursday. That's next Thursday, October the 21st at 7 p.m. Eastern, on the topic, A Class Struggle History, The Peasants' Revolt of 1381, with Gary Porter. In the meantime, please be safe, stay healthy, stay active. Bye for now.